18,000 feet above the South China Sea, the world is stripped of color. It is a landscape of gray clouds, blue water, and blinding white sunlight. Inside the cockpit of a Curtiss P-40E Warhawk, the environment is hostile. It is unpressurized. It is freezing. The vibration of the massive V12 engine travels through the floorboards, up the seat, and settles deep in the pilot's bones. It is a sensation of raw, mechanical violence contained within a thin skin of aluminum. The date is December 12th, 1941. 5 days ago, the world changed. On December 7th, the Japanese Imperial Navy struck Pearl Harbor, crippling the U.S. Pacific Fleet. But while the smoke was still clearing in Hawaii, a second, perhaps even more brutal catastrophe was unfolding 5,000 miles to the west. The Philippines are burning. The Far East Air Force, the Spear of Asia, has been snapped in two. The airfields at Clark and Iba are graveyards of twisted metal. The command structure has evaporated. The radar network is silent. And the Japanese are coming. Not in a raid, but in an invasion.
First Lieutenant Boyd "Buzz" Wagner is flying north toward Apari. He is the commander of the 17th Pursuit Squadron, or at least what is left of it. His orders are vague. Reconnaissance. Find out where the enemy is. Find out what they are bringing. As he banks his aircraft over the northern tip of Luzon, he looks down through the breaks in the cloud deck. He expects to see a beachhead, maybe a few transport ships unloading infantry. What he sees instead is a nightmare. Below him, the captured airfield at Apari is teeming with the rising sun. Wagner counts the silhouettes, twin-engined Mitsubishi bombers lining the runway, props spinning, preparing for the next strike on Manila. Around them, the wasp-like shapes of fighter escorts. Above them, a combat air patrol, a defensive umbrella of fighters circling lazily, securing the airspace. By conservative estimates, there are 50 enemy aircraft. Some reports say nearly 2 full Sentais, 64 planes. Boyd Wagner is one man. He has 6.5 caliber machine guns. He has a limited supply of fuel, and he is alone.
In 1941, the conventional wisdom of aerial warfare was clear. You do not engage against these odds. You do not fight the Japanese Air Force on its own terms. You run. You survive to report. But Boyd Wagner wasn't just a pilot. He was an aeronautical engineer. He understood the physics of energy, the geometry of angles, and the structural limitations of materials. He looked at the swarm below him and didn't see a death sentence. He saw a math problem. And he knew exactly how to solve it. He checks his gun switches. He adjusts his mixture. He rolls inverted. To truly understand the suicide mission Wagner was about to undertake and why his solution was so revolutionary, we have to understand the week of hell that preceded it. History often compresses the timeline of the Pacific War. We jump from the shock of Pearl Harbor to the Doolittle raid, then to Midway. But for the men stationed in the Philippines, the war didn't start with a surprise attack on a Sunday morning. It started with a terrifying, agonizing wait. In late 1941, the Philippines was the forward edge of the battle area. General Douglas MacArthur had convinced Washington that the islands could be defended. The plan relied heavily on the B-17 Flying Fortress, the aerial artillery that would smash Japanese invasion fleets before they reached the beaches. Defending these bombers were the P-40 Warhawks. On paper, the Far East Air Force was formidable. In reality, it was a hollow shell. The logistics chain stretched 7,000 miles across the Pacific, and it was broken.
At Clark Field, mechanics were scavenging parts from wrecked planes to keep others flying. They were critically low on Prestone, the vital glycol coolant needed for the P-40's liquid-cooled engines. Without Prestone, a P-40 is just a static display. The ammunition belts for the .5 caliber guns were often old, the powder degrading in the tropical heat, leading to jams. The oxygen systems for high-altitude flight were in short supply. But the biggest failure was information. The Americans had installed the SCR-270 radar system at Iba Field. It was state-of-the-art technology, capable of detecting incoming aircraft over 100 miles away. On the morning of December 8th, which was December 7th in Hawaii due to the international dateline, news of Pearl Harbor reached Manila at roughly 3 a.m. The pilots were woken up. They ran to their planes. They sat in their cockpits, engines warm, sweating in the tropical heat, waiting for the order to scramble. They waited and waited. For reasons that are still debated by historians, a mix of incompetence, communication breakdowns, and MacArthur's hesitation, the order to launch a preemptive strike on the Japanese airfields in Formosa never came. Instead, as the sun rose higher, the pilots were ordered to shut down their engines. They climbed out of their cockpits and went to lunch. At 12:35 p.m., while the pilots were eating in the mess hall, a formation of 54 Mitsubishi G4M Betty bombers and 34 escort fighters arrived over Clark Field. They dropped their ordnance with training ground precision. The first wave of bombs walked across the hangars and the fuel dumps. The second wave shattered the B-17s lined up neatly on the tarmac. Then came the fighters. The Japanese pilots dropped to treetop level, conducting strafing runs that lasted for over an hour. It was a slaughter. The P-40s that managed to get airborne were bounced immediately, caught low and slow, their wheels barely retracted. At Iba Field, the radar station, the only eye the Americans had, was bombed out of existence. By sunset on December 8th, half of the Far East Air Force had been destroyed. The psychological impact on the surviving pilots was devastating. They had been raised on a diet of racial overconfidence, told that the Japanese were inferior pilots who flew canvas biplanes and couldn't shoot straight. Now they were facing veterans of the China War, men who flew with a terrifying aggression and precision. The morale in the briefing rooms hit rock bottom. The pilots felt their planes were heavy, slow, and useless. They felt their leadership had failed them. They were angry, terrified, and looking for a way to fight back. This is the atmosphere in which Buzz Wagner found himself. To understand how Wagner survived what was to come, we have to get technical. We have to look at the machines. Because this wasn't just a fight between two men. It was a clash of two completely different engineering philosophies. Let's look at the enemy first. In popular culture, every Japanese plane is called the Zero. And indeed, the Zero was in the theater. But at Apari, covering the Army landings, Wagner likely faced the Nakajima K-27, codenamed Nate by the Allies. The Nate was the primary fighter of the Japanese Army Air Force. It was a throwback. It had fixed landing gear that didn't retract. It was incredibly light, weighing only 3,900 pounds loaded. It was designed for one thing, the dogfight. Its wing loading was so low that it could turn inside almost any aircraft in the sky. If you tried to turn with a Nate, it would be behind you in less than 2 circles. But it was fragile. It had no armor for the pilot. It had no self-sealing fuel tanks. And its armament was light, just 2 7.7mm machine guns, similar to a WWII rifle caliber. Now, the P-40E Warhawk. If the Nate was a rapier, the P-40 was a sledgehammer. It was built by Curtiss Wright, and it was heavy. Fully loaded, it weighed over 8,000 pounds, literally twice the weight of the Japanese fighter. Pilots called it a flying brick. It had a poor rate of climb. It felt sluggish on the controls compared to the featherweight Japanese fighters. The heart of the beast was the Allison V-1710 liquid-cooled V12 engine. It was rugged and reliable, but it had an Achilles heel. The Army Air Corps, in a massive doctrinal blunder before the war, had decided that the P-40 would be a low-altitude coastal defender. As a result, they ordered it with a single-stage supercharger. This meant that above 15,000 feet, the engine gasped for air. Its horsepower dropped off a cliff. Against a high-flying Japanese fighter, the P-40 was fighting with one hand tied behind its back. But Wagner knew the P-40 had hidden strengths that most pilots ignored. First, armor. A heavy steel plate behind the seat protected the pilot's spine. The windshield was bullet-resistant glass. Second, self-sealing tanks. A layer of rubber swelled upon contact with gasoline, plugging bullet holes instantly. And third, the guns. The P-40E carried 6 Browning M2 .50 caliber heavy machine guns, the Ma-Deuce. This is a crucial distinction. The Japanese 7.7 millimeter was a glorified rifle round. It poked holes. The American .50 caliber was a structural wrecking ball. A 2-second burst from a P-40 delivered enough kinetic energy to shred a wing spar. Wagner was obsessed with convergence. The guns were mounted in the wings, spread far apart. You had to set them to cross paths at a specific distance, usually 250 or 300 yards. Wagner realized that the P-40 wasn't a dogfighter. It was an energy fighter. Its weight, which made it climb slowly, made it dive like a meteor. It could exceed 450 miles per hour in a dive without shaking apart. The Japanese planes, if they dove that fast, their light airframes would warp. Their ailerons would stiffen, making them impossible to roll. If they pulled out too hard, their wings would snap off. Wagner's thesis was simple. Do not play their game. If you turn, you die. If you climb, you die. But if you dive, you are the king. So who was the man in the cockpit? Boyd David Wagner, born in 1916 in Pennsylvania. He wasn't your typical hotshot flyboy who flew on instinct. He was an intellectual. He studied aeronautical engineering at the University of Pittsburgh before joining the Army Air Corps. This background is critical. While other pilots were feeling the plane, Wagner was calculating drag coefficients and manifold pressure limits. He didn't just fly the P-40, he understood the stress loads on the rivets. He had earned the nickname Buzz not because of his flying style, but because he supposedly buzzed the control tower during his training days, a rare moment of recklessness in an otherwise disciplined career. By December 1941, Wagner was commanding the 17th Pursuit Squadron. When the war started, he saw the panic setting in. He saw pilots trying to turn with Japanese fighters, trying to dogfight a turning specialist, and getting chewed up. He knew that morale was linked to survival. If the men believed the Japanese were invincible, they were already dead. He needed to prove the engineering theory in combat. On December 12th, he didn't just volunteer for the mission to Apari, he claimed it. He took off from Clark Field with a wingman, Lieutenant Russell Church. But halfway to the target, they encountered bad weather. Church's plane developed engine trouble, or perhaps they simply lost visual contact in the clouds. The records vary. But the result was the same. Church turned back. Wagner pressed on alone. This is a specific type of courage. It's one thing to charge into battle with your squadron, surrounded by friends. It is another thing entirely to fly hundreds of miles into enemy territory solo, with no radio support, no radar coverage, and no hope of rescue if you go down. If Wagner's engine failed, he would crash in the jungle and be captured by the Japanese army.
A fate that, as the world would soon learn from the horrors of the Bataan Death March, was often worse than death. He checked his fuel mixture. He checked his gun switches. He armed the 6.50 calibers. He arrived over Apari at 18,000 feet. The sun was high. The stage was set. Wagner surveys the scene. The airfield is a beehive. He spots the Japanese fighters, likely Nates, patrolling at lower altitudes. He has the advantage of altitude. In the language of air combat, he has potential energy. He can convert that height into speed whenever he wants. He positions himself up-sun. This is a classic tactic. He puts the blinding glare of the tropical sun directly behind him. Any Japanese lookout looking up in his direction will see nothing but white fire. He commits. He rolls the P-40 inverted and pulls into a split S dive. Gravity grabs the 4-ton aircraft. The Allison engine screams as the prop pitch adjusts. The airspeed indicator winds up. 250, 300, 350, 400 miles per hour. At this speed, the wind noise is a physical presence hammering against the plexiglass. The controls become heavy, stiffening under the airflow. This is where the P-40 shines. While a Japanese plane would be shaking apart, the P-40 becomes a stable, deadly gun platform. Wagner targets 2 Japanese fighters patrolling roughly 2,000 feet above the runway. They are cruising at low speed, completely unaware that a sledgehammer is falling on them from the stratosphere. Wagner closes the distance at a rate of 200 miles per hour faster than his targets. He has seconds to act. He waits. He holds his fire. Discipline. 600 yards. 400 yards. At 300 yards, the convergence point, he squeezes the trigger. 6 streams of armor-piercing incendiary rounds converge on the lead fighter. The effect is instantaneous. The fragile Nate doesn't just take damage, it vaporizes. The wing structure fails, and the plane disintegrates into a cloud of burning aluminum and fabric. Wagner doesn't pause. He kicks the rudder, skidding the P-40 slightly to the right. He lines up the second fighter. The second pilot has just realized he is under attack. He starts to bank. Too late. Wagner walks the tracers through the cockpit and engine. The second plane erupts in flames and corkscrews into the jungle. 2 kills in less than 10 seconds. Now, the element of surprise is gone. The hornet's nest has been kicked. Tracers from the ground begin to arc upward, black puffs of flak and red streaks of machine gun fire. The fighters patrolling higher up see the explosion and dive to intercept. This is the moment where a lesser pilot would panic and turn. If Wagner turns now, he bleeds his speed. He becomes slow, and a slow P-40 is a dead P-40. Instead, he pulls back on the stick. He uses his massive speed to zoom climb back up into the heavens. He trades kinetic energy back for potential energy. The Japanese fighters try to follow, but their lightweight engines can't match his momentum. They stall out, falling back toward the earth, while Wagner soars back to safety. He is safe. He has 2 kills. He has the intel. He should go home. But Buzz Wagner looks down at the rows of bombers parked on the runway. He knows these planes are being prepped to bomb his friends at Clark Field. He makes a decision that defies all logic. He attacks again. He dives for a strafing run. He levels out just above the tree line, roaring over the airfield at 350 miles per hour. He lines up on the parked aircraft. He depresses the trigger and holds it. He walks a river of lead down the flight line. One bomber explodes, then another, then a fighter, then a fuel truck. According to the citation, he destroys 5 aircraft on the ground in a single pass. The .50 caliber rounds punch through the unarmored Japanese engines like they are made of paper. But now he is low. He is out of altitude, and there is a fighter on his tail. A Japanese fighter slots in behind him. The pilot is good. Bullets whiz past Wagner's canopy, pinging off the armor plate behind his head. This is the nightmare scenario.
Low altitude, low energy, a more agile opponent on your 6. Wagner slams the throttle through the gate, emergency war power. The Allison engine howls, pushing past its rated limits. He knows he can't outturn the Nate. If he banks even 30 degrees, the Japanese pilot will cut inside his turn radius and kill him. So he does the one thing the Japanese plane hates. He goes fast. Wagner pushes the nose down, hugging the contours of the terrain, flying feet above the jungle canopy. He flies erratically, skidding the plane side to side. The Japanese pilot tries to follow, but as he pushes his nose down to track Wagner, his engine sputters. The float-style carburetor on the Japanese engine cuts out under negative Gs. The engine starves for fuel. Wagner's fuel-injected Allison doesn't care about gravity. It keeps pumping power. Slowly, agonizingly, the distance opens up. 300 yards, 500 yards, 1,000 yards. The Japanese pilot, unable to catch the speeding American bullet, breaks off. Wagner is alone again. Wagner touched down at Clark Field with his fuel gauges hovering near empty. His plane was scarred, bullet holes in the fuselage, soot on the gun ports, oil smeared on the windscreen. He climbed out of the cockpit drenched in sweat, shaking from the adrenaline dump. He had destroyed 2 planes in the air, 5 on the ground, and brought back vital intelligence. But he brought back something more important: the blueprint. Wagner gathered the pilots of the 17th Pursuit Squadron. He explained what he did. Don't dogfight. Hit and run. Use the dive. Trust the armor. He turned the P-40's greatest weakness, its weight, into its greatest weapon. 4 days later, leading a flight near Vegan, Wagner and his wingmen used these exact tactics to devastating effect. Wagner shot down his 5th plane, officially becoming the first United States Army Air Force ace of World War II. The myth of Japanese invincibility was shattered. The Japanese fighter could be beaten, not by magic, but by physics. The story of the Philippines, sadly, does not have a happy ending. Despite the heroism of men like Wagner, the sheer weight of the Japanese offensive was too much. The islands fell. Thousands of Americans and Filipinos were captured. Wagner was evacuated to Australia just before the collapse to train new pilots. He passed on his knowledge, teaching the next generation of aces, men like Richard Bong and Tommy Maguire, how to survive. Tragically, Boyd Wagner survived the most dangerous skies in history, only to vanish in a routine flight. In November 1942, while flying a P-40K from Florida to Alabama, he disappeared. His wreckage was found weeks later. He was 26 years old. Buzz Wagner is often overshadowed by later heroes of the Pacific, but we must remember the context of December 1941, when the world was falling apart, when the radar was dead, when the leadership was paralyzed, and when the enemy seemed unstoppable. One man climbed into a broken logistics chain, flew into the heart of the enemy swarm, and proved that they could bleed. He didn't just fight a battle. He solved the problem of the Pacific Air War. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the technical and tactical history of the early war, please subscribe. And let me know in the comments, in a scenario like Apari, would you trust the agility of the Japanese fighters or the rugged speed of the P-40?